it might actually be evidence of a persistent physical energy field. We're diving into the idea that the brain's internal body map, what neuroscientists sometimes call the neuromatrix, might actually sustain a measurable biophoton field, a kind of biophotonic self, which maybe lingers at amputation sites. And let's face it, for decades, conventional approaches, things like mirror box therapy, they've only offered pretty limited, often partial relief for phantom pain. So the central question for us today is this. Do the established facts we know about biophotons and maybe the unique requirements of life itself, do these mandate that we shift our research priorities? That we really try to overcome the frankly formidable technological and philosophical barriers needed to test this pretty radical hypothesis? I'm going to argue that the logical imperative, which stems from the unique causal powers of the living substrate, really demands we take this exploratory path.
Okay. And I can definitely see why let's call it the apparent failure of some conventional methods creates an appetite for these kinds of radical alternatives. However, I'm coming at this from a position of, well, empirical skepticism. While the hypothesis is certainly fascinating, the gap between the measurable facts, like biophotons existing, and the really radical conclusion you're drawing that a persistent energy field exists, well, that gap is immense. I'll be arguing that the technical hurdles, what we're calling the observation challenge, combined with the current, frankly, lack of mechanistic evidence, make pursuing this path right now infeasible and insufficiently supported. I think we have to prioritize scientific resources toward the overwhelmingly established neurological explanation for phantom sensation. You know, the one that relies on cortical reorganization and neuroplasticity, not ghost in the machine, so to speak.
Phantom sensation resists conventional methods for so long, we have to look at the foundation of the biological system itself. So let's start with an established fact: ultra-weak photon emission, or biophotons. This is real. It's a known, measurable phenomenon produced by pretty much every living organism, from bacteria right up to us humans. And it's caused simply by excited electrons relaxing during, routine chemical reactions and cellular metabolism.
And crucially, the foundational material, particularly the research summarized in sources like You Stop Glowing When You Die, confirms that this visible wavelength biophoton emission, it's intrinsically linked to life itself. The emission diminishes rapidly, significantly after death. And this isn't just theory. It's validated by recent studies like one in 2025 on mice, showing a marked decrease in biophoton emission immediately post-mortem. So the signal, it's like a literal physical expression of biological activity, and it seems to just stop when the life force ceases.
Okay, look, that biophotons are a byproduct of life is, well, it's undisputed. They are the weak light emitted when metabolism is running. I grant you that. But your conclusion represents a really profound logical jump. You're moving from saying metabolism produces weak light to claiming that this weak light constitutes some kind of persistent quantum self field sustained by the intentionality of the neural matrix? That's where the premise gets shaky for me.
But I think the premise is logically sound precisely because it addresses the organization of life. Think about the brain's central body mapping system, this neuromatrix. It's often described as a genetically determined internal blueprint for the entire self. It acts as the ultimate biological organizer. Now, if this internal mind map is constantly sustained by living chemical processes, and we know those processes produce a physical, measurable field of light, however weak, then isn't it plausible that the neuromatrix could act as a kind of, quantum or biophotonic generator, a generator that sustains a coherent field that corresponds precisely to the perceived limb? Maybe the only reason we haven't detected it is because, current researchers are not doing it right. They haven't targeted the right frequency, or maybe they haven't developed the tools to look for a coherent patterned field instead of just assuming it's uniform random light pollution.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that kind of inversion of the scientific burden of proof. The conventional view is it's overwhelmingly established. Phantom sensation results from maladaptive neurological reorganization. Basically, the cortical area responsible for the missing limb gets sort of taken over by adjacent areas. This creates crosstalk and, well, misinterpretation of signals. The barrier to your hypothesis isn't really philosophical, it's brutally technical. Biophotons are ultra-weak. We are talking about, what, tens to hundreds per second. Just to give some context, the human eye needs something like 1 million photons per second just to register even dim light. So the signal you're proposing is exceptionally weak, and it's completely obscured by all the existing biological noise and, of course, environmental light.
The simple fact that there are currently, as the sources confirm, absolutely zero studies measuring biophoton emission from amputees or at amputation sites, well, that reinforces that technical insufficiency is the primary reason the idea remains unverified. Not lack of trying, but lack of ability.
Okay, and that brings us directly to our first major point of contention, this technological wall. But look, if this phenomenon is the true physical substrate of consciousness or the self, then the challenge of measurement, well, it's irrelevant to its actual existence, isn't it?
I wouldn't frame the technical barrier, the observation challenge, as irrelevant. I'd frame it as prohibitive for current research prioritization. Right now, the signal-to-noise ratio is essentially 0. To successfully test your biophotonic self-hypothesis, we would need the development of entirely new, high-sensitivity analytical technologies that simply do not exist in the field today. Period. We need things like arrays of microscale chemical sensors for real-time metabolomics just to rule out chemical noise. We'd need high-speed, non-invasive microscopy to track potential microstructures or these spatiotemporal patterns you're suggesting. And then, on top of all that, sophisticated signal processing and machine learning just to even have a hope of finding a coherent pattern distinct from all the normal random biological dynamics. Until we actually achieve these foundational breakthroughs, pursuing this hypothesis is, I think, scientifically premature. It feels more like a declaration of what we hope to measure someday, not a practical research objective for right now.
Challenge is probably a necessary step for all research into complex, emergent biological phenomena, not just this one specific hypothesis. The exact same technological limitation, for instance, prevents progress in detecting emergent chemical systems in synthetic abiogenesis experiments. We can't detect the subtle molecular gradients needed for primitive life assembly there either. So the commitment to trying to prove the phantom limb, maybe it forces the invention of these necessary tools. We're talking about technology that can detect extremely weak, patterned electromagnetic fields within complex, noisy biological systems. I mean, when we do invent the required sensor and imaging technologies, the high-speed microscopy, the advanced signal processing, we don't just potentially solve the phantom limb mystery. We might unlock the ability to detect a whole host of other subtle, non-neuronal phenomena across all of biological computation, like molecular communication or complex metabolic rhythms. You know the saying, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. It's often proof that our current tools are just inadequate for the frontier. My logic assumes I'm right until you can prove I'm wrong by failing to measure it with adequate tools. Right now, the only obstacle seems to be the inability to measure it properly. That's a science problem, a how-to problem, not a whether it exists problem.
Okay, your argument rests on this idea of the logical necessity of invention, but that feels like an inversion of the scientific method that undermines sound prioritization. We have to invest where the mechanistic evidence is strongest, or at least where the path to evidence is clearer.
And this leads me to the second point, which is where I find perhaps the weakest link in your argument, this causal leap you take regarding the supposedly unique nature of biological matter.
But the leap, as you call it, I believe is necessary and rooted in the unique causal powers that are inherent in the biological substrate itself. The most fundamental evidence for this is homochirality. We're talking about molecular handedness, the fact that life universally, exclusively utilizes L amino acids and D sugars. Now, this isn't just some historical accident. The sources suggest it's the essential molecular feature needed for stable, self-organizing chemistry and, crucially, emergent computation. The sources confirm that without homochirality, if you had a racemic, a 50-50 mix of L and D molecules, the chemical environment basically descends into computational chaos.
It just can't sustain the stable structures needed for things like complex computation or protein folding or even reliable polymerization. So since living systems are cognitive systems, it seems logical that the required mechanism for consciousness must be etched into this precise chiral structure. It justifies focusing on the unique physics of the biological substrate, something, silicone just doesn't have.
I'm still not convinced by that line of reasoning, mainly because I think you're confusing enablement with causation. Homochirality is, yes, undoubtedly necessary for life as we know it. RNA polymerization, for example, fails catastrophically with racemic mixtures, and stable protein folding absolutely requires those L-amino acids. But necessity for life doesn't automatically equate to necessity for consciousness. Many major, quite established consciousness theories, like integrated information theory, for instance, are explicitly substrate neutral. They focus on the organizational structure, the complexity of information processing, not on the specific molecular handedness of the substrate that happens to be carrying that information. The sources we're looking at explicitly conclude that homochirality is likely a correlation without causation when it comes to subjective experience itself. Yes, it enables the biological machinery to exist, but the specific geometric handedness probably isn't the mechanism for thought or consciousness per se.
But wait, the very existence of specific quantum biological effects, like chiral-induced spin selectivity, or cis, doesn't that strengthen the case for unique causal powers? Cis shows that chiral molecules literally act as spin filters for electrons passing through them. So if the biological substrate introduces these unique structure-dependent quantum dynamics, then a purely functional, non-chiral architecture like a standard computer chip might simply lack the required physical basis to sustain a coherent, persistent field like the one I'm proposing, regardless of how complex the algorithm running on it is. This suggests that the quality of consciousness, or maybe its very possibility, is tied directly to the fundamental physics of the living structure itself.
Okay, cis is a fascinating physical effect, I grant you that. But there seems to be a fatal disconnect when you try to link cis mechanistically to conscious neural computation. Don't match up. They're mismatched by maybe 6 orders of magnitude, perhaps even more. These quantum effects of cis happen on the femtosecond scale. That's trillions of a second. Neural processing, the kind that underpins the neuromatrix and our subjective experience, operates on the millisecond scale, thousands of a second. You really can't bridge that immense temporal gap to claim that these fleeting femtosecond quantum events are somehow sustaining a persistent macro-scale self-field that lasts potentially for years after amputation. The connection, I have to say, remains purely speculative at this point. Well, if you think that link is purely speculative, let's return to what I see as the most powerful empirical evidence supporting the idea of a self-sustaining field tied directly to life itself. The interpretation of the death signal. This is our third point. The sources detailing how you stop glowing when you die are pretty clear. Biophotons aren't just measurable, they decrease significantly after death. And furthermore, they're amplified when the body is under stress, when it's sick or hurt. Injury produces reactive oxygen species, ROS, which sets off more biophoton emission. You can even see this in something as simple as a cut plant leaf glowing brighter. Now, this profound sensitivity to biological state, life, death, stress, intentional injury, doesn't that align perfectly with a biophotonic self that's sustained and maybe even actively monitored by the living neuromatrix? It suggests it's not just random chemical light. It's a light that responds dynamically to the internal state of the whole system in real time. Maybe the light doesn't just stop because metabolism stops. Perhaps it diminishes as the entire self-organizing, intentional system loses its cohesive power. I absolutely see why you find that correlation compelling, I do. But the conventional interpretation is frankly far more parsimonious. The cessation of visible wavelength biophotons at death, it simply marks the cessation of the normal metabolic functions that produce them in the first place.
As we agreed, the light is caused by excited electrons relaxing after they've been involved in highly ordered processes like cellular respiration and other metabolic pathways. So when respiration stops, the energy source stops and the light stops. It's straightforward chemistry. And as for the amplification during injury or sickness, that's also entirely consistent with standard chemistry. Reactive oxygen species, ROS, which we know are generated in abundance during cellular damage and stress responses, are key chemical signaling molecules. Their formation and subsequent breakdown are well known to release energy, including producing biophotons. So yes, the phenomenon is a powerful biomarker of life, cellular damage, and chemical state. Absolutely.
but it is not, I argue, proof of some separate quantum field sustained by conscious intent or the neuromatrix.
It reflects chemistry in action, maybe chemistry in active repair, not a ghost limb held in place by the mind map.
But look, if we accept that the neural matrix is the ultimate integrator of the self, right? And if we accept that the unique physics of the living substrate, chirality, maybe cis, is required for that neural matrix to even function properly, and if we accept that the living state produces a unique, detectable energy field, however faint, that demonstrably ceases when the structure loses its self-organizing power, then why would we stop short of rigorously testing the physical implications of that continuous field? The logical path, the scientific curiosity, it seems to demand the investigation.
Because fundamentally, we have to prioritize empirical feasibility, and we must address the existing, overwhelmingly established neurological model first. The current evidence is still heavily weighted toward cortical plasticity explaining phantom phenomena. We must invent the future, yes, but we should do so based on a reasonably high probability of success, guided by verifiable evidence and testable mechanisms, not solely on logical necessity inferred from rather unique but perhaps causally distant chemical properties.
Okay, well, my position remains firm. Given that biophotons are undeniably real, their emission demonstrably ceases upon death, and that biological complexity seems to rely on unique causal powers like homochirality, I believe the pioneering approach actually trying to test the biophotonic self-hypothesis is the only path that directly addresses the truly fundamental questions of mind and matter. Questions that conventional neurology, frankly, with its limited success in fully treating phantom pain, hasn't managed to solve. We have, I think, a philosophical and logical mandate to proceed. Even if the technology is currently insufficient, we have to make it sufficient.
And I have to reiterate the critical data gaps. The hypothesis is currently unproven, primarily due to the seemingly insurmountable observation challenge, the lack of requisite foundational technology, and also because of the enormous, unverified causal leap from necessary life chemistry, like homochirality, to a necessary consciousness mechanism or a persistent field. While the biological substrate is undeniably unique and fascinating, its uniqueness is, more likely than not, simply enabling the required complexity for consciousness, not fundamentally causing subjective experience in this specific way or sustaining a persistent energy field after physical disruption. For now, the evidence remains insufficient to justify abandoning the robust, albeit incomplete, neurological explanation for phantom sensation.
Well, perhaps this debate really illuminates the profound reality that the next great breakthroughs, whether in consciousness studies or fundamental biology, might hinge entirely on our ability to develop new foundational technology tools capable of observing these incredibly subtle emergent phenomena that currently lie just beyond our observational reach.
That's a sentiment on which we can certainly agree, even if we fundamentally disagree on which particular high-stakes hypothesis most deserves that initial, massive technological investment right now.